Welcome everyone to a new series of interviews, which I like to call History Speaks. We have a great and very talented lineup of speakers coming to your screen soon. So today it's the turn of a lady who's not only a professional journalist, editor and author, but also has that passion for content creation. However, today she's here to talk with us about her main passion being the life of Mary Tudor and her book, In Her Own Right, a novel of Mary Lady Tudor. So please give a very warm welcome to our friend across the pond, Amanda Schiavo. Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great. It's great to be here with you, John. I really appreciate you having me on.
No, it's absolutely fine. I think it's my honour really to have such an esteemed author on the show. But I've got a very serious question to start us off. Coffee or tea? Are you one of those brave souls who runs purely on energy and enthusiasm, which I've seen, of course, when you do your cosplay? So if it is coffee, we're going to get along just fine. If it's tea, well, I guess we'll still be friends, but with a slight sense of betrayal.
It is absolutely coffee.
And that's all I wanted to know. I went around in a slightly long-winded, drawn-out way there, but we got there. So welcome today. So today, obviously, we're going to be talking about your book, In Her Own Right, a novel of Lady Mary Tudor. But before we get into that, I'd like to start by asking you, how did you first become interested in history and what's your background?
Yeah, absolutely. I was in middle school when my mom gave me a copy of Carolee Erickson's biography of Anne Boleyn titled Mistress Anne. And I just was hooked after that and became absolutely fascinated by the Tudors. And as I grew older, I expanded my interest into different areas of European, medieval, and Renaissance history. I have a BA in history from Pace University, and I turned that into a decade-long career in journalism. And I've continued to study history in my adult life. I love to read nonfiction and biographies by the experts like Tracy Borman and Alison Weir and Gareth Russell. Anna Whitelock's biography of Mary Tudor is fascinating. And just to name a few of the people I enjoy reading and studying.
So is your full-time job as a journalist then? And this is more like an interest on the side sort of thing?
Yes, yes.
All right, cool. So when you set out and to write this book about Mary the First, what brought you to conclusion that this was the person you really wanted to kind of study or write about and research and everything?
Yeah, my desire to write a novel about Mary came from a desire to read a novel about Mary. I started writing In Her Own Right. It was like 2018, and there weren't many novels out there where Mary was the main character or where she was portrayed with balance and nuance. She's a character that's kind of often sidelined or, a player in other people's stories. But her own story is equally as fascinating as any of the other Tudor monarchs. And, I decided to sit down and start writing and not really believing I would finish it, let alone end up getting it published.
It's quite a daunting task, I guess, to especially on a character as big as Mary. She's a massive character.
Oh, yeah.
Um, we all know that Mary's been famously depicted in unusual ways, we could put it, in the art world over the years. But of all the portraits, why do you think the one by Anthony Moore fascinates people the most?
I think because it's very striking and very bold. You look at this portrait and you are looking at a queen. You can see power. You can see Mary's resemblance to her father, Henry VIII. And I also think it's fascinating because it's real. The portrait was painted in 1554, 1 year after she becomes queen. So she would have been about 30 at the time, which for the Tudor period was considered old. It's an image that's a mix of powerful and subtle because she's she's in a very simple gown. She's holding a rose. She's not overly done with jewels. She's not wearing her crown, but she still looks very, very regal. And there's no propaganda in this image, which is something that her sister Elizabeth becomes very, very good at. when we're looking at this portrait of Mary, I think we're looking at Mary's true face. And we can see the trauma of her life sort of etched into her face. Mary's legend makes her out to be a monster. But you don't see that in this image. You see, a battle-hardened woman showing her true self to the world. And I think that's what resonates with people.
Mm. And it is. It's a really strong portrait, like you say. I mean, the guy who did it, I think he was Dutch, something like that. And he was highly sought of apparently around European courts doing these type of images. And if you do look at some of his paintings, they are really striking, and they all kind of have that same pose as well, where the characters are upright and like a really strong demeanor about them, sort of thing. So yeah, it is a really good picture, and it is the one I think most people recognize as being obviously Mary at the time. Um, let's move on to another one here. We've got modern historians have obviously got differing views on Mary and the turbulent religious and political environment of that 16th century, which was obviously rampant across Europe. But how do you think kind of Mary's viewed today in the modern era?
I think the legend of Bloody Mary is still very prominent in the minds of the general population. She's very easily cast as a villain, whereas her sister is very easily cast as a heroine. And that tends to be the lens that Mary is often viewed through, especially when you look at her depiction within the media. Films like Elizabeth with Kate Blanchett from the 90s, or the Elizabeth R TV series from the 70s. Mary's portrayed as sort of weak and hysterical and tyrannical and lovesick over her husband. And, Elizabeth is the complete opposite of that. And, it's very easy to sort of paint her as the villain and sort of a sad, pathetic character. And I think in the general population, that is the image of Mary that people kind of go to. But there is definitely been a push by historians to really kind of clear up that image and look at her as a fully fleshed out human being.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I think there's too much emphasis put on the bloody rather than the woman herself. And obviously behind the woman, there's obviously a fascinating character there. And there's something that people who are interested want to get to know.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about the fact that she burnt all these Protestants or whatever she did, and passed these laws to try and bring back Catholicism, etc. So it is, yeah, there is far more to her than just that side, but it's trying to change people's opinions. I think that's the problem, because it's kind of entrenched in people now that Mary the First is Bloody Mary, and that's it. It's the end of, she did this, that, and then, to be honest, I don't think she executed as many people as her father.
Not even close.
Not even close to it. So it's a real conundrum, really, that one. Queen Mary, as we know, she's a pivotal figure in women's history for her resilience and determination. And she obviously left a lasting impact on women in leadership as well. So apart from her battles throughout life, what makes Mary, for you, such an icon of women's history?
It's fascinating. Mary is the reason that queens regnant in England rule, and not their husbands. In April of 1554, Parliament passed the Act for Regal Power, which made it law that queens regnant would hold power fully, wholly, and absolutely as their male counterparts. And I just think that's so fascinating, because I think, at least from an American perspective, we think of England and we think of queens. And without Mary, they didn't have that power. They wouldn't have had that power. And I just think that's absolutely fascinating. I do think, however, though, it's a mistake to cast Mary and even her sister as sort of feminist icons, because they lived in a time where women were considered inferior to men in all things, especially when it came to intelligence and the ability to govern. Mary actually does hold to that belief, but in her mind and the minds of those around her who supported her, she was the exception. God chose her to be the example. She was the exception to the rule of the weaker sex. And this belief was so prevalent that when Mary's marriage was being negotiated, the documents that were drawn up, they made sure to express very, very clearly that Mary the sovereign and Mary Philip's wife were two totally, totally different people. And I think that kind of goes back to like Henry VIII's fear of female rule, because they were basically owned by their husbands. So there was this fear that even a queen would be, subjugated by their spouse. And Mary does keep her husband out of most of England's affairs. But there's a lot of struggle with that, and Philip tends to resent that. And when Philip wants England's help in the war with France in 1557, 1558, both he and Mary kind of play the husband card. And she kind of, plays that up to her council and to Parliament, like, I owe this to my husband. And this is actually a huge theme in the sequel that I'm working on. Mary's constantly struggling, battling with her duty to her husband and her duty as queen.
Well, we'll get to your sequel a little bit later on, because I'm going to ask you all about that sort of stuff anyway. So do you think, I agree with what you said, that women have always been kind of under the men, regardless of what level they're at power-wise. Do you think that opinion kind of changed when Elizabeth came? Because they'd already had Mary, although Mary wasn't on the throne for a particularly long period of time, about 5 years or so. But do you think that kind of view changed about women in power? I know it's quite difficult to say, because obviously she was such a strong woman, Elizabeth. But I'm just wondering whether you think maybe that kind of thought process of women being overruled kind of turned full circle, because Elizabeth really came across as a strong character.
Yeah, what's actually fascinating is when Elizabeth is on the throne, there's a rumor that swirls throughout Europe that she's actually a man, because she's doing so well that she couldn't possibly actually be a woman. So I think it kind of goes back to that idea that female monarchs were the exception. Because again, Mary and Elizabeth don't really do too much to promote the advancement of women. Mary does have a lot more female advisors. They don't hold seats within, the government or on the council or anything like that. But pretty much everyone knew if they wanted to get to Mary, they had to kind of go through her, flock of women that were around.
Exactly.
But with Elizabeth, I think again, it's just kind of just like they looked at her as like an outlier. She was this was a fluke that she did so well, and she did it so well without a husband. Because, again, after Elizabeth, from Elizabeth to Mary II, we have nothing but a succession of male monarchs. So I think it's more of the exception to the rule idea than kind of changing anything on its head.
And that was beautifully spoken and linked to my very next question, which is, when Elizabeth came to the throne, it must surely have all about being. I'll start that again, because I'm just talking waffle. When Elizabeth came to the throne, it must have been about her getting married and producing an heir. So when it came to marriage, why do you think Mary did, but Elizabeth didn't?
Mary very much wanted to have a husband and have children. I think had her brother Edward lived, or even if her father had allowed it, I theorize that Henry was terrified of Mary, but we could talk about that later. I think she would have been very happy to be married off to some handsome Catholic prince or noble, having her babies, living the life of a wealthy royal woman. Mary was very traditional in that sense, because the one constant in her life was her faith, and she held on to that with both hands. And that's what her faith told her was the natural position for women. And it was something that she believed in. With Elizabeth, there's a lot of theories as to why she never married. Some historians theorize that she was afraid of marriage, considering the examples set by her father. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed. Her first stepmother, Jane Seymour, dies only a few days after giving birth. Her second stepmother, Anne of Cleves, is discarded. Her third, Catherine Howard, executed. And her final stepmother, who she was the closest to, Catherine Parr, dies also after childbirth. And all of this happens before Elizabeth is 16. So that definitely has a lasting traumatic effect. Elizabeth, also had the benefit of learning from Mary's mistakes. She would have seen how unpopular her sister's marriage to Philip of Spain was. The people hated Mary's choice of a spouse. And I think that's really when Mary started to lose her popularity. Again, Elizabeth benefited from learning from Mary's marital mistakes. It also just benefited Elizabeth politically to keep suitors on the hook versus actually agreeing to marry and make an alliance. Elizabeth was arguably the most desired woman in Europe when she came to the throne, and playing that game benefited her more, I think, than a marriage would have. And then there's also the theory that she just simply did not want to share her power or have to answer to anyone. And that's something that we know that she has in common with her father. So she chose to remain single. So I think there's a lot of elements, a lot of layers you can peel back of the onion of why Elizabeth doesn't marry.
We might have slightly covered that in what you've just said, but it is intriguing to consider how Mary and Elizabeth's relationship might have unfolded over the years. I mean, I'm guessing you've seen Becoming Elizabeth and shows like that, so they're quite interesting. Whether they're factually accurate, I guess, is another thing, because sometimes they make these things more for entertainment than for facts. But my question would be, do you think Mary and Elizabeth would get along well? Did get along well together, even though that they had different aspirations?
Yeah, to a point, Mary and Elizabeth had a loving and sisterly relationship. Mary, she cared greatly for Elizabeth when she was a child, and after their brother was born, there was no more dispute over the succession, so there was no more competition between them. There was a period, where Mary didn't view Elizabeth as a threat. When she's a child, Mary sends Elizabeth gifts, invites her to, come live with her at different periods, puts money towards her education. When Mary's invited back to court after the fall of Anne Boleyn, she updates Henry on how Elizabeth is doing, telling him he has reason to be proud of his youngest daughter. So she does advocate for Elizabeth at different points in her life. Elizabeth rides into London behind Mary after she takes back the throne. She's at Mary's coronation. She spends a lot of time at court, but it wasn't long after Mary becomes queen that their relationship falls apart. Mary eventually even imprisons Elizabeth in the Tower of London, and she releases her. It's on the anniversary of Anne Boleyn's execution. I don't think that was coincidence. I think that was a very deliberate message to her sister. Elizabeth was seen as the great hope for Protestant England in the same way that Mary was the great hope for the country's Catholics. So once religion and the throne really started to dominate their lives, that was the thing that would always come between them and always drive a wedge between them.
Mm. Was Mary, in your opinion, kind of really bloody, or should we cast that thought as a myth?
Okay, buckle up, because I've got a lot to say about this one.
Say it. You're saying
Mary is no more or less bloody than the monarchs who came before her and for a time after her. There is no denying or excusing or erasing the fact that 280 people died by the flames during Mary's reign. She's definitely the shortest reigning Tudor monarch, and some Mary detractors kind of say that the only reason she didn't burn more people is because she died. But I don't think speculation is a valid argument. And you also have to remember that this is a period of time where bloody and gruesome deaths were the norm. So when we look at Henry VIII, he's credited with having more than 50,000 people put to death during his reign. One man was even boiled alive. Elizabeth had at least 1,000 people executed during her reign, mainly using the method of a traitor's death, which, as we all know, is very, very gruesome as well. James I had a pathological hatred of women and a fear of witches that was even considered extreme for the time. And it's estimated that about 4,000 accused witches were put to death by fire when he ruled. So this idea of Bloody Mary really, truly is a myth. And it's testament to that old cliche that history is written by the victors, because the term Bloody Mary wasn't used to describe Mary until the end of the Jacobean era. And that information comes from a historian named Gregory Slies. At this point, Protestantism is firmly entrenched into the national identity, and Catholicism, and Englishness are considered, incompatible. Following the attempts of the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, Catholicism was increasingly associated with treason in England. And there was this fear around the return of Catholicism's influence, in England. So it made Mary and the Protestant persecutions a very easy target for fear mongering. In the late 1650s, there was this fear that James, the Duke of York, second son of Charles I, and converted Catholic, would become king. And, within Protestant political circles, this was just unthinkable. And, a couple of decades later, there is a murder. Prominent justice of the peace is murdered, and the crime is pinned on a group of Catholic priests. Whether or not they actually did it is still unclear, but it sets off this wave of anti-Catholic hysteria, and fear around the Duke of York's succession just grew. And, propaganda is a great tool. These leaflets were distributed suggesting that there would be another wave of Protestant persecutions by Catholics, like the ones that Mary was responsible for. And there was even an anonymous pamphlet that stated people were crying out, quote, no popish successors, no idolaters, no Queen Mary in breeches. So it was really easy to just pluck Mary out of history and make her that villain. And there was a play that was performed in the 1680s where it was called The Coronation of Queen Elizabeth. And it showed these really dramatic and fictionalized scenes of Mary being made a saint as a reward for her brutality against Protestants, excuse me. And again, with all of these kinds of things, fears over the crown's return to Catholicism intensified, but then so did the need to vilify Mary as cruel, brutal, a tyrant, and thus the legend of Bloody Mary was born.
There you go. Fantastic. Yeah. So, moving on from that one, overall, how would you describe Mary today? Do you think she was successful or a complete letdown for the country at the time?
I think in the beginning, she was successful. I think, it's both. She was a human being. She was flawed. She made mistakes. She did things that were great for the country. There's another myth around Mary that she just believes Elizabeth this rudderless, economically, destroyed system. But that's not 100% accurate. She does actually get Parliament to pass some laws that helped improve the economy, improve the lives of the working poor, improve trade. She built up the Navy. She again passes the law that places regal authority fully within Queen's regnant. But then she makes mistakes. She revives old heresy laws. She doesn't. Mary saw things in black and white, and that was it. She did not allow for any wiggle room. So, and again, this is a period of time where from the moment you're born, your main concern is supposed to be your afterlife. And for Mary, securing your afterlife meant Catholicism, strict adherence to Catholicism, and Protestantism was a disease that she felt she had to root out. She goes about it in an extreme and misguided way. And so we tend to just focus on the negative. But like I said, there were other things that she did, like improving the economy, improving the lives of the poor, building up the Navy. So like anybody else, there were good things, there were bad things. I don't think she was a complete and total success, and I don't think she was a complete and total failure.
Fascinating, as always, the life of Mary Tudor. But we've not finished yet. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. And the first one's from Agnes. So her question is to you: what is the likelihood that had Mary been smarter about her marriage choice, for example, and married a Catholic duke from England or Ireland and ignored Philip II, and then had a living child that she and her line would have been accepted and maybe would have thrived for generations? If that makes any sort of sense. It's quite a long question.
The likelihood. I don't think it was likely that Mary was going to choose any other husband. We have the benefit of sitting here in 2024 and looking back and judging and say Mary made a mistake in her choice of husband. I don't think one of Mary's flaws was that she she had tunnel vision, and I don't think she was ever going to choose a husband not from Spain. Um, and I think that had a lot to do with keeping the connection to her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Um, one of her greater supporters was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain. Even though he didn't do much to help her or anything to help her take back her throne, he didn't think she was going to do it, but she did. I don't think it was likely that Mary would have chosen any other husband than somebody from Spain. It was deeply, deeply unpopular with the English people. And again, Mary was in her late 30s when she becomes queen. And for the time period, that was considered old. Mary also struggled with health issues her entire life, especially menstrual health issues. So I don't think it was likely, no matter who her husband was, that she would have had a child and would have continued her line. So yeah, again, we can sit here in 2024 and say Mary made a mistake, but at the time she was too tunnel vision. The connection with Spain was too important to her for her to choose any other husband.
I was going to ask you actually about that because the connection with Spain and the mother, do you think that stayed with her throughout her younger years and it was something she was always determined to do, or was it because the Catholicism was obviously deep rooted in Spain at that time, but maybe not so much in England? So it kind of filled that void for her, that her option was to go to Spain and look for a husband who's also Catholic.
Somebody her mother would have absolutely approved of. Mary is bullied into submission by her father. He forces her to sign the oath that acknowledges him as supreme head of the Church of England, acknowledges the invalidity of his marriage to Catherine and her own status as a bastard. Mary signs this document. She never forgives herself for what she considers the ultimate betrayal of her mother. And I think, whether consciously or subconsciously, she spends the remainder of her life trying to make it up to her mother and get her mother's forgiveness, forgive herself for what she considers the ultimate betrayal of her mother. And I think that was just always in the back of her mind. And, again, that connection with Spain, a marriage to Spain, was one of the ways she was going to do that.
I think Agnes will be very pleased by your answer there because it's probably clearly settled that point, I think. I've got another question here from Nikki. When it came to the removal of Lady Jane Grey from the throne, was it Mary's intent to have the poor child executed, or were there other forces or considerations beyond the control at the time?
Yeah, absolutely not. Mary, to her credit, Mary absolutely realized that Jane Grey did not take her throne by choice. It was, the machinations of the men around Jane, of Edward, the fear of the return to Catholicism. And so Jane Grey was the only legitimate choice. Both Mary and Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate at one point. I think for the briefest of moments, they may have looked to Elizabeth instead of Jane, but her bastard status, her mother's fall from grace, the fact that even at such a young age, they knew they were never going to be able to control Elizabeth, and the fact that at that point, Elizabeth was absolutely not going to betray Mary. They had to cut both sisters out of the line of succession, and there's the Lady Jane Grey, 15, 16, 17-year-old child who was as fervent a Protestant as Mary was a Catholic. And Mary had every intention of going through the trial, knowing Jane would be sentenced to death, commuting the sentence, waiting for things to calm down, and then sending Jane off somewhere far away in the country, probably, or maybe even convincing her to become Catholic and maybe join a nunnery to really just kind of get her out of the way in that sense. And I think that would have been a huge win for Mary if she was able to get Edward's great hope for Protestantism to convert. Because even though, Mary and Jane were at complete opposite ends of the religious spectrum. When they present Jane Grey with the crown, she steps back. She says, "No, this is not mine." She refuses to touch it. She says, "This is not mine by right. Mary is the rightful heir. I have no claim to this." And she's sort of bullied into accepting the throne. And again, Mary, I really do think, and we can base this on the evidence, that Mary would have spared her life if it weren't for the Wyatt Rebellion and the fact that Jane's father gets involved and declares for Queen Jane. Mary kind of realizes this child is always going to be there. Spain threatens not to go through with the marriage because Mary's throne isn't secure. And Mary makes the decision to follow through on Jane's death sentence. She does try several times to get Jane to convert before she's executed. Jane refuses. There's a story, I'm not 100% sure if this is one of those things that actually happened or just sort of became a myth, but there's a story that she sent her physician to check on Jane to see if she was pregnant because she was married. So that would have given her another 9 months of delaying the execution. So Mary didn't want to, but ultimately came to the realization that she had to execute the Lady Jane Grey.
It's a tragic storyline. It really is. I mean, such a young girl, like you said, 15 or 16 or however old she was, to be put in that position by kind of men of power, Northumberland, weren't it?
And men who were supposed to protect her.
Yeah, I mean, they should be like kind of chaperoning her rather than forcing her into a situation as grim as it all turned out to be in the end. So yeah, it's anyway, Nikki, I hope that's answered your question because we're going to be here all day. I appreciate that. It's a great answer. But I'm going to move on to what you're going to be doing next and stuff like that. So what plans have you got for the future, and especially any plans for a new book?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I sat down to write In Her Own Right, I knew that I wanted to tell Mary's story in 2 parts. I wanted to end the first book, spoiler alert, it ends with Mary's coronation. And I chose to do that because I truly believe Mary deserved that moment of triumph, that moment of sitting on the throne and the belief that, the future was wide open and I could be a great, fantastic ruler that everyone will love. Like she deserved that moment with that crown on her head. And that's why I chose to end the first book there. I am currently working on the second book. I have about a chapter left to go in the first draft. And that is going to be a novel of the 5 years of Mary's reign. And there's a lot going on in there. There is the struggles with her husband. Mary suffers 2 phantom pregnancies. Those were very difficult to write. The Protestant burnings take a tremendous plot point in the book. And so yeah, my goal is to get that manuscript to my publisher by the end of the year. So hopefully the sequel will come out next year. After that, I don't know. I would love to continue to write novels about different women in history. I have Caterina Sforza in my head. I don't know much about her. I don't know much about Italian politics at the time. So that'll take some research, but she's definitely in my head. And I think she would be fascinating to explore as well.
I was going to ask you because obviously living in the US, you don't have the access probably that people do in Europe to some of these records. And how difficult is it to research somebody like Mary I? Is it been a real tough task?
Yeah, it's finding biographers who came at her with that balance was difficult, because a lot of people they either detract from her or, she's the greatest thing ever. And so finding books, finding biographies with the balance was difficult, but I came across a few. And luckily, there are legitimate websites, historic royal palaces, places like that where I could go and look at copies of primary sources, primary documents. So it was hard. Yeah. And one thing that was really hard was when I'm describing, certain palaces and things. I've been to London several times, but, my memory's not great when it comes to all the little details. So having to rely on photos from the internet, that was kind of difficult. So yeah, so it definitely had some difficult elements to it, not having the ready access that I would if say I was living in London.
Yeah, it is difficult. I think it's something I asked Estelle about when I spoke to her, um, because obviously she has access to the original manuscripts and papers and letters and everything. And it must be really difficult for yourself to even get close to something like that. So you have to take a kind of roundabout route, I guess, to try and find out as much as you can, which possibly may take even more research than what an historian has access to, because they can obviously go and look at these documents and things like that. So yeah, so fair play to you. It's really good. It's really good. Now I know you've got a big presence on social media. So if people want to find out more, where can they find you? And where can they buy
Absolutely.
your and where can they buy your book, which is more
Oh, well,
important?
fantastic. You can buy my book from the publisher directly, Black Rose Writing. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any major online retailer. I don't have an in-store presence yet, but maybe that'll change. And as far as social media, you can find me on TikTok and Instagram under the handle for both at author Amanda Schiavo.
Marvelous. And don't forget, folks, that all Amanda's links will be down below in that description box. So go and check out everything she does. Oh, quickly, tell me how this cosplay started.
This cosplay
Because
started.
when they go to Instagram, they're going to see you dressed up and
Yeah.
everything. So tell me how it all started.
When I first joined History Talk, I made two absolutely wonderful friends who are both History Talk cosplayers. And I had reached out to both of them about my book, and they were both so gracious and did reviews of the book. And, I was talking about different ways to market the book, and they were both so supportive. And they were like, join us in the cosplay world. So I went on Etsy and I found a beautiful Tudor gown that somebody made from like handmade. And so I have that, and I go on TikTok and I find sounds that I think would be, either relevant to Mary's story, whether they're, like scenes from Becoming Elizabeth or the Tudors or something like that, or just funny things that I, think would a modern audience might get a chuckle at about Mary's life. And yeah, so I throw on the gown and I do my little skits, and it's hilarious because if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have said absolutely not. What are you crazy? Put myself out there on the internet? Like what? Absolutely not. And now I'm doing all of these interviews and cosplay and did you know videos, and I'm just like I'm like, who are you? What are you doing?
It is really good. I mean, is that the only costume you've got, by the way? I've seen you in one. Is it just the one you use for every?
I had two. One of them, unfortunately, my dog got sick on, so I had to throw that little. Now it is just the one dress.
Okay. Well, it's great. I mean, it is very light-hearted. It is funny, and I'm sure that people will want to go and check you out just for that, if nothing else, because it's not every day somebody dresses up as Mary the First. And I think that's a perfect place to call it a wrap. So Amanda, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day today to come and talk to me for half an hour or so. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. I'm sure everyone watching feels the same. So I'm going to wish you all the best in the world with future success and your future endeavors. And I, for one, will eagerly be awaiting that next book, those 5 years of Mary.
Great. It was really great conversation, great back and forth. It was a really good time.
And finally, to everyone who's tuned in, thanks for joining us on this journey. This interview is just the beginning. It's the first in a series that we are excited to bring you here on the channel. We've got some incredible names lined up. So if you love history, you're definitely going to love what we have in store here on History Roadshow. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and of course hit that notification bell so you don't miss a thing. And until next time, keep exploring the past with us, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you.